My wife tells me that good evening, everyone. Good evening. I'm glad to have you all here. It's a great crowd on a Thursday night when we have lots of great activities and lots of great holidays happening. So I appreciate you all being here. Welcome to the Tocqueville Lecture Series. The Tocqueville Lecture Series is named after Alexis de Tocqueville. Born of the French aristocracy, Tocqueville examined the world to understand democracy. His investigations convinced him that liberal ideas, which rejected both the antiquity of aristocracy and doubted the promises of the French Revolution, were the progression of history. Whether individuals fought for or against these ideals, he was convinced that equality of conditions is a providential fact. This lecture series invites scholars, professionals, and civic leaders to present on the ideas of liberty and equality as they relate to other concepts important in the founding and continuation of American government. Hosted on the campus of Jacksonville State University, these free lectures are open to the public. This series welcomes the campus, community, and country to listen, think, reflect, and engage with each other. The Tocqueville Lecture Series is funded by generous grants from the Jack Miller Center and the Alabama Humanities Alliance. The Jack Miller Center is dedicated to advancing education in America's history, its political and economic institutions, and the central principles, ideas, and issues arising from the American and Western traditions, which continue to animate our national life. The Alabama Humanities Alliance exists to provide context, build empathy, and make the state of Alabama a more vibrant place to live, all through the humanities. It's my pleasure tonight to introduce Dr. Erin Dolgoy. She's an associate professor of politics and law and the chair of that department at Rhodes College. She's also a graduate of Michigan State University, go Spartans, although the tournament was not too kind to them this year. And she started her academic journey in Canada at the University of Toronto and then the University of Alabama. Her research focuses on the social and political influences of science and technology in modern thought in contemporary America. She is the co-editor of Short Stories and Political Philosophy, Power, Prose, and Persuasion, and the book Political Theory on Death and Dying. It should be noted that Erin's work reaches beyond the academic ecosphere and provides benefit to society as a whole, as demonstrated by the success of these books. In addition to these works, she has other publications on the topics of leadership, wit and comedy, and modern science. I will share I've learned a wealth of information about her from Francis Bacon, or about Francis Bacon, especially her examination of Bacon's essays. It's rigorous and phenomenal. And she's been a very generous and caring person in my education. She's also a co-editor of the Politics and Contemporary Television book series at Rowman and Littlefield. And she gives an incredible amount of energy in this area through editing and improving the writings of others. If testimonials are necessary, I'm more than happy to share how she took a young, struggling graduate student and helped them make sense of some of Rousseau's ideas on doctors and medicine to make it into a worthwhile dissertation chapter. But I will stop filibustering now, and I will shut up myself and turn the mic over to Dr. Erin Dolgoy.
Thank you so much, Mr. Rhodes, for that very kind and generous introduction. And thank you to all of you for coming on this Thursday afternoon on a holiday weekend, which is amazing. This turnout is incredible. I am grateful to be here. And I am very thankful for the opportunity to speak with you today about the political thought and activism of Sarah and Angelina Grimké. And before we begin this topic, I'd just like to be clear that it includes discussions of slavery, rape, violence, sickness, and the Bible. It is impossible to talk about Sarah and Angelina without addressing these topics, and it's impossible to talk about this period in American history without addressing these topics. This project is part of a larger work that is collaborative and co-authored with Kimberly Hale, who is a professor at Coastal Carolina. Unfortunately, she can't be here with us. And this is a small part of a much larger project. And like all of the best projects, the more research we do, the more research we realize actually needs to be done. So with that in mind, I will begin. I start by framing this discussion with a question, which is actually 3 questions, like all the best questions, you need sub-questions to flesh it out. So this question goes like this. What do you do when you live in a world that you believe needs turned upside down? That is, what do you do if you think the world that you live in is itself unjust? How do we know the world we live in, with its morals and values, its legal system, its social order, is actually just? And what happens if you determine that it is not just, that everyone else seems to think it is? And this is how I sort of frame my consideration of Sarah and Angelina Grimké's thought. There's, in my view, something incredibly perennial or enduring in asking these questions. That is, the very act of asking these questions and interrogating our regnant beliefs and social norms, the political orders that we inherit, our religious orders, the philosophic systems into which we are born. There's something so incredibly human about asking these questions about whether or not the political system that we live in is in fact just. And I think if we all think deeply, perhaps not even that deeply, we can think of examples where we wonder why things are the way that they are. Why is the world that we live in the way it is? With all of the beautiful parts of it and all of the parts that are torturous. We are fortunate that we are in fact not the first person to ever think about justice, equality, the social order, law, or even God. There are countless innumerable examples or helps from the past and present that we can learn from. Today, I will focus on 2 figures. Sisters born in the early 1800s in the South in Charleston, in a very turbulent time in the history of the United States, in a time of political unrest, partisan divides, censorship and suppression, violence, economic and racial inequality, and social upheaval. I'd like to start with a question. How many of you have heard of Sarah and Angelina Grimké? It's interesting because Sarah and Angelina are sisters born into a rich, powerful, privileged, white slave-holding family in Charleston. They lived in a world that they believed needed to be turned upside down. They looked at their own social order, its slave-holding values, its hierarchy, its wealth, its inequality, its segregation, its violence, what they regarded as a perversion of Christian values, its subjugation of enslaved Black people and of women, and vast amounts of wealth, privilege, and freedom. And they declared that it was in fact unjust and corrupt. They argued that to be a white person in the South was to be corrupted, and to be a person in America who was not fighting against slavery was to be complicit. White women, they argue, despite their own subjugation and dependence on the men in their lives, are as culpable as white men in upholding the slave state. White women are involved in perpetuating violence against enslaved men and women, they argue, condoning the acts of sexual violence committed against enslaved Black women by their white husbands and sons, and teaching their children to hate and harm. All those individuals who benefit from the horrors of slavery provide their tacit consent, they argue, and support for the American slave state. Their political philosophy offers us an early portrait of the distance between American ideals, including certain aspects of American Puritan ideals, and American political reality. Their activism provides us with a guide of how you affect social change against great odds. Because they loved America, they loved their family, but they also recognized that unless they stood up against the injustice that they witnessed on a daily basis, change would never actually happen. So far, does anyone have any questions, concerns, points of anger? Okay. So the outline of today's talk is pretty simple. Feel free to interject if you do have questions. I teach at a liberal arts school. I'm used to questions from the crowd. They're exciting. They add a depth to a lecture often. And they take us in directions that we may not expect. Outline is pretty simple. I'm going to talk about my approach, and I'm going to talk about how I typically read historical philosophic texts and why I choose to read them that way. I'm going to do this just to prime us to be able to think through the Grimkes. The next very simple why study Sarah and Angelina Grimké question. I think we should always provide a justification. When we read Locke and Hobbes, people don't usually ask us, why Locke and Hobbes? I can't remember the last time I was at a public lecture or a conference where someone wrote a paper on Hobbes and someone in the audience like, oh, why Hobbes? I get asked this question a lot. So I'm going to provide an explanation and justification of why I think we should spend our time thinking a little bit more deeply about Sarah and Angelina Grimké, people who are not already primed to think about it. Third, I'm going to talk about their critique of the Bible and the clergy. I will explain in a moment why and how they took the Bible seriously and why that's so essential for understanding their thought. Fourth, I'll talk about the role of women and their call to action for Southern white women. And then I'll talk a little bit about what it means to live in a world that you regard as upside down and what sort of more contemporary lessons we can take away from Sarah and Angelina Grimké's example. Okay. As Mr. Gross noted, much of my research concerns the history of political thought. That is, I spend a lot of time I spend a lot of time reading and studying ideas from the past to help us better understand not only the past, but also our own present and the potentials for the future. I have found that in many ways, it's often easier for many of us to evaluate, criticize, praise, and interrogate key ideas from historical texts as opposed to those examples or arguments in our own lives. And I don't use the term easier, meaning it's not more arduous or challenging or difficult. I use the term easier here to mean we're often more receptive in criticizing our predecessors than we are criticizing our contemporaries, actually. And criticizing the regimes of the past, the ideas and arguments that were posited by people in the past, as opposed to criticizing our present. Why? I think the social stakes are actually disagreeing with Rousseau's critique of women is somehow not an offense. But when we disagree with the critiques of our contemporaries, they feel that. We see their response. So there's something about reading the books of the past that help us develop the tools that we can use to be more critical citizens in the present, more critical readers, more receptive, all of those things. So what I mean is that the stakes are a little bit different when we're grappling with the present than when we're grappling with the past. We know how those stories turned out, right? We know what happened to some. I know. 5 people in the room know what happened to Sarah and Angelina Grimké, but we'll all know in a few minutes, right? We know how it turned out, right? So we have a different perspective that we can bring to these historical texts. So for that reason, we can often be more exacting in our analysis, because we don't have to grapple with the immediate political or tangible consequences of our interpretations. That is, the way we interpret the past, it matters for our present, but they're not here to give a defense of what they did, right? They're not here to provide us with an alternative. It's just us and what they left us, the architecture of what they left us, the books, the reading system. Okay. So hopefully we'll be able to discern some similarities in the political questions, debates, and concerns that Sarah and Angelina Grimké were grappling with and that we are grappling with today. So a few presuppositions about my approach to reading Sarah and Angelina's work, and I try and read them with a sense of humility. I try and think about really what they were attempting to accomplish, what they could have possibly known, etc. So the first is, I think when we read texts, especially Sarah and Angelina's work, we should think of it as intentional and purposeful. They were careful writers. They wrote carefully. While they didn't know everything was going to be published, they do talk about the ways in which they know people will be offended by what they wrote. So they were writing carefully, even their private letters. Political philosophers use a fancy term for this. They call it logographic necessity. They trace it to Plato's Phaedrus, where he says, in good writing, every part is necessary to the whole. So if you want to call this something fancy, call it logographic necessity. And if you don't want to call it something fancy, you're just taking seriously the people who wrote before you. The second is that they were motivated by a sincere and genuine desire to change the world, not for fame and honor. In fact, in much of their writing, they talk about how they do not want a public life, but they feel compelled to print what they think is true about the world. So they wrote and criticized their own regime because they believed it was the right thing to do. And throughout their writing, they present themselves as moved to speak in opposition to slavery. And from their perspective, they had no choice. So for them, they had to act. They had a true compulsion to write. And I will say that I often get asked when I talk about Sarah and Angelina Grimké, like, how did they come to the conclusions that they come to in the end? And the answer to that is they looked at the world that they lived in, and they made an assessment based on their reason, their experience, and their religious convictions. Those three things. And often people aren't satisfied by that answer, but I think that is the best answer we can give them. They looked at the world that they lived in, and they assessed it based on their reason, their experience, and their true religious conviction. It's a question I've actually not heard asked about Locke or Hobbes either. How did Locke and Hobbes reach the conclusions that they reached? Well, they thought about it and they came to the conclusion. And I don't know how often we ask that follow-up, but really, how did they come to that conclusion? So I get asked this a lot about Sarah and Angelina because they're not already acknowledged or accepted as sort of part of the philosophic canon, which I think is a side conversation we can have later about how we decide who we should take seriously and who we should. Okay, so that's number 2. Sincere desire, genuine desire to change the world. The third is they are devout Christians who truly believe in the truth of Christ and the authenticity of the Bible. And I delivered a paper on this topic at the Southern Political Science Conference in, I think that was January, though it feels a long time ago. And a grad student in the audience asked why they relied so heavily on the Bible. And I think at this point it's really important just for all of us to remember that at this point in history, the Bible was the true account of God's will and the history of the world. So if you wanted to make an argument about anything, you had to ground it in the Bible. That's what your contemporaries believed. And Sarah and Angelina believed that as well. And I say that not because we don't know it, that it's important to remember that for them, that was the agreed upon document. Everything you needed to know about the appropriate design and history of the world was in the Bible, right? They weren't critiquing the authenticity of the Bible or its legitimacy. They hadn't yet sent archaeologists out into the world to debunk the stories, right? They were believed mostly to be true. And so in the same way that in the United States, we look to the Constitution, during this period of time, we look to the Bible. And there weren't that many books published at this point in time, and it was pretty much guaranteed that everyone in their audience would know the Bible, like they would know these stories. And what they're debating is how you interpret the text, right? What you do with the text. Okay, so they're devout Christians who truly believe in the truth of Christ and the authenticity of the Bible, and their goal here is not to create beautiful, persuasive, untrue arguments. So they don't want to be rhetorically persuasive. They don't want their audience to simply agree with them. They want their audience to know it to be true. So they're not, this isn't like a disingenuous project to affect political change. They really believe in the truth of what they're doing. So they're not simply making arguments connected to the Bible or the Enlightenment because they think they will be persuasive. They're making what they think are true arguments about the nature of the human experience. Is that clear? Mostly clear? Okay, good. Okay, so those are my the first 3 presuppositions. The next one is that they were radical and infamous. And we do not remember them, but their contemporaries knew them. And some of their contemporaries thought they were amazing ladies. They didn't use that language. And other of their contemporaries despised them and tried to punish them. And so the Grimké sisters really risked their well-being and their lives in order to undertake this project. So they really were radical. Sarah Grimké undertook a national speaking tour before women were legally permitted to speak in public spaces before audiences of men. So she undertook a public speaking tour to promote abolition. Angelina was the first woman to ever speak in front of a legislative body in the United States, the Massachusetts General Assembly, on February 21st, 1838, where she presented a petition with the signatures of over 20,000 white and black Massachusetts women who were demanding that slavery be banished from the District of Columbia. Their work was published in pamphlets and newspapers. Their work was burned on the Charleston Pier. So one of their pamphlets was burned on the Charleston Pier. They were kicked out of polite Charleston society for being troublemakers. I could keep going, but really I think the point is very clear that they were by all 19th century measures infamous and regarded by many as incredibly dangerous. And as a consequence, number 5, they were in danger at all times. And I'll elaborate a little bit on this, but really their attack of the clergy resulted in sort of pamphlets being written about how they were dangerous, ungodly females. So Sarah and Angelina Grimké, radicals in their own time. Questions, concerns, observations? Okay, so who are they exactly? Sarah Grimké was born in 1792, and her younger sister Angelina Grimké in 1805. They were raised in a prominent, wealthy slaveholding family in Charleston, South Carolina, in the early 1800s. They spent time in the family's city home and on their rice plantation, Belmont, as well as other country properties, surrounded by affluent, strict hierarchy and the enslaved people who made their lifestyle possible. By any measure, the Grimké sisters were true elites in the society in which they lived, with pedigree. And they experienced all of the possible advantages afforded to Southern white women of their station. Their family had deep roots in South Carolina. The Grimké side of the family was descended from Huguenots on one side who had fled to South Carolina to avoid religious persecution in France in the early 1600s, and German merchants on the other. The mother's family, the Smiths, owned a slave plantation and were merchants. Their grandfather was involved in the drafting of the South Carolina Act, or the South Carolina Slave Codes, which were later reinforced by their father. John Grimké, their father, was educated at Princeton and then was sent abroad to England to continue his education, first at Cambridge and then at the Inns of Court. John Grimké was a revolutionary. He signed a petition addressed to King George III demanding independence, and he returned to South Carolina from England in 1775 to fight in the Revolutionary War for the Continental Army. As was true of so many young men at this time, between 1775 and 1781, he was arrested and imprisoned, released and arrested and imprisoned. After the war, he pursued a public life in politics and law. Between 1783 and 1819, he was elected and served as an associate judge in the South Carolina Court of Common Pleas and General Sessions, which is both the civil court and the criminal court. He was elected to and served in the South Carolina State Legislature between 1782 and 1790. He was intendant of Charleston, which is basically the mayor, between 1786 and 1788. And he was on the committee that reviewed and accepted the federal constitution for the United States on behalf of South Carolina. John Grimké's professional pedigree gives us a sense, I think, of how power was distributed during this time. When I wrote out this list, I thought about this before, but then when I wrote out the list, I realized how many overlapping jobs he actually had simultaneously, right? He was a judge, he was a state representative, he was a mayor, he was on this committee, so which I hadn't thought about until I wrote it out quite in this way. So it's not quite the checks and balances we've come to expect from government. The bulk of John Grimké's career was spent as a judge and a legal scholar. He wrote numerous tracts on law and legal interpretation. He died in 1819 under the care of his daughter Sarah on the coast of New Jersey, where he had traveled to seek treatment for an undiagnosed health condition. I think it's defined as wasting sickness. And Gerda Lerner actually writes quite a bit about sort of the lives of Sarah and Angelina Grimké, and said that this was actually a formative event in Sarah's life because she was sent to the north with her ailing father, and for the first time in her life, she had a type of freedom from the trappings of sort of high Charleston society. And once she got this taste of freedom, she really was unwilling to return to the life that she had been brought up to lead. As an aside, their mother, Mary Grimké's brother, Benjamin Smith, served as a personal assistant to George Washington during the Revolutionary War, and also served as the governor of North Carolina, but just for 1 year to get a sense of the family's pedigree. John and Mary Grimké had 14 children, 11 of whom survived infancy, including Sarah and Angelina, who were born 13 years apart as the 6th and 13th children. According to the legends, real legends, I like to call them legends. According to the legends, when Angelina was born, Sarah took her under her wing to care for her and teach her the right way to be. And it's interesting because the sisters lived together throughout their lives, and you can really see how intertwined their lives were became. So I guess Sarah was successful in her education of Angelina. John Grimké also fathered at least 3 children through the rape of enslaved African women, a common yet undiscussed practice at the time. Sarah and Angelina both write about this practice in their writing, and many scholars know that they're some of the first women to actually publicly talk about the sexual violence that happened during this period in the United States. Their upbringing was strict and Episcopalian. The Grimké girls were educated by tutors, trained in housekeeping and slave management, and prepared to enter society as good, marriageable women and dutiful mothers. The Grimké sons were educated in Latin and sent to prestigious universities, including Yale, and were trained as lawyers and doctors. To be clear, the Grimké and Smith families owned hundreds of enslaved people and were themselves anti-abolitionists. Their entire way of life, their social order, their wealth and privilege was contingent on maintaining the slave state and their position within it. There are numerous records to support these claims. Sarah and Angelina were waited on by enslaved people from the time they were babies. They witnessed the horrors of slave society, the injustice, the violence, the rapes, and the cruelty. What they witnessed was not unique, a point they returned to throughout their writing. It would have been impossible, they argued, to live in the South and not witness or be affected by the atrocities of slavery. It is well known that white women in the United States were not granted the right to vote until 1920 and had very limited property rights and formal educational opportunities. Women and girls were generally regarded as dependent and weak. Their virtue was attributed to their obedience and submission to their fathers, brothers, husbands, and other men. These disparities were formative for the sisters, who possessed a great deal of intelligence but were barred from receiving the formal education granted to their brothers. Later in life, Sarah comments on the miserably deficient education of white women who are taught to regard marriage as the one thing needful. The worth of women was determined solely by their external charms and their ability to attract the notice and win the attention of men. Sarah's and Angelina's lives were dictated by these social norms. Their father barred Sarah from his library when he caught her reading one of his law books, after earlier discovering that she had been teaching any enslaved African-American child to read. At this point in time, teaching an African-American to read or write was a crime according to the South Carolina Act of 1740, punishable by a 100-pound fine. Sarah was reprimanded, Hetty was whipped. Sarah privately vowed to keep teaching Hetty to read secretly at night in her room. She later commented on how Sarah later commented on how she delighted in defying the laws of South Carolina and never ceased to sneak into her father's library. Ultimately, their father grew to overlook Sarah's small transgressions and more serious crimes, despairing over her intractability. He once remarked that if Sarah had been born a man, she would have been the finest jurist in the country. Despite their personal advantages, Sarah and Angelina were horrified by the entrenched hierarchy, classism, and racism and violence on which the slave states were founded and their own privileges were dependent. Sarah left South Carolina in 1819, eventually joining the Quakers of Philadelphia. 10 years later, in 1829, Angelina, despairing at the futility of combating slavery in her hometown, joined her sister. If anyone has any questions about this, I'm happy to talk about this very formative period in Angelina's life where she joined the Quaker Church in Charleston and was accused of sexual impropriety because the members of the church were male and she was, now I'm telling the story. The members of the church were male and she was in a building, locked in a building with men all day, and obviously that was wildly inappropriate, and she was basically driven out of town. Sorry. It happens, I was very excited. They reunited in Philadelphia, where they joined the abolitionist movement and became early advocates of racial and sexual equality in America. Their political activism is accompanied by their detailed, nuanced political thought. In their writing, the Grimké sisters align the Enlightenment ideals of universal reason and universal natural rights with the legacy of Protestant religiosity. They're also very influenced by Wollstonecraft, which I'm happy to talk about later, but I won't do it right now. Watch this self-control. In practice, the Grimkés argued that the ideals of the Enlightenment, in order to be true, must be applied to all people, including white women, black men, and black women. As Sarah writes in her unfinished manuscript, Marriage, human rights are not based upon sex, color, capacity, or condition. They are universal, inalienable, and eternal. And none but despots will deny to women supreme sovereignty over her own person and conduct which law concedes to men. The rights that are guaranteed to men, they argue, must be applied to all people. Their work both builds off the pioneers of the Enlightenment, early feminist thought, the American abolitionist movement, and their own devout, idiosyncratic, scriptural interpretations. As a result of their abolitionist beliefs, which threatened the political, social, and moral hierarchy in the slave-holding South, they were ostracized from Southern society, and after moving north, they were marginalized in the North as well, which, despite describing the formal institution of slavery, maintained legal and cultural oppression of African Americans and women. And I think if you look at their writing, they believed that they were moving to some type of utopian state in the North in contrast to the South. And when they got there, they found that that was not actually the case. Sarah and Angelina gained public notoriety in 1835 after Angelina sent a private letter, Slavery in the Boston Riots, to William Lloyd Garrison, publisher and founder of the anti-slavery newspaper, The Liberator, which he published without her permission. And I was thinking about my emails, and I wonder what's going to happen to them in the future, and my text messages. So she wrote a letter, she thought it was private, it was made public, and then she was infamous. In the early and mid-1830s, political tensions in the United States were incredibly high. After the 1807 passage of the Act prohibiting the importation of slaves, many Southern states passed legislation to ensure the perpetuation of slavery. In response to an increase in abolitionist sentiment and agitation from African Americans and white folks, in November 1830, North Carolina passed an act to prevent the circulation of seditious publications, which made the importation of any publication with a tendency to inspire revolution or resistance among enslaved or free black people a capital offense. Similar laws had been passed throughout the South, prohibiting African Americans from reading, writing, assembling, and rebelling, and punishing white people for participating in or abetting these crimes. Northern abolitionists at this time adopted a new tactic. They engaged in a mass mailing of sending abolitionist literature to the South, conducting a petition campaign, and holding public meetings. And in 1834, there were anti-abolition riots in New York and Philadelphia. These are really important for sort of Sarah and Angelina's political activism. In 1835, the poet John Greeley Whittier and the British abolitionist George Thompson were stoned in Concord, New Hampshire. Then in October 1835, Thompson was invited to Boston to speak at the female anti-slavery meeting. A mob broke out at the meeting. They were looking for Thompson, but they found Garrison instead and dragged him to the streets at the end of a road. Garrison had to be rescued by the mayor and was held overnight in jail for safekeeping and then urged to leave town. Sarah's epistle was written after she and her sister had attended the American Anti-Slavery Society meeting in New York. The goal of the American Anti-Slavery Society was clear: immediate abolition. Political tensions and social tensions were high, and Sarah and Angelina determined that they could no longer be silent. During this time, in 1835, the House of Representatives also adopted a rule prohibiting the House from officially receiving or considering any petition calling for the abolition of slavery. This gag rule basically prevented the House, although it did pass in the Senate, from even discussing the possibility of abolition. And it led to an increase in sort of this melee campaign by abolitionists. And the Grimké sisters believed that this law was incredibly unjust, and they felt themselves compelled to act. And they had read, and they had prayed, and they had thought, and then they acted, which is sort of the ways in which they think we should undertake activism. But they wrote letters and essays at this time and started delivering speeches outlining their arguments against slavery all over the country. They argued in favor of equal rights for women and racial minorities. I list their most significant writings here. In 1838, Angelina becomes the first woman to speak in front of a legislative body in the United States, the Massachusetts State Legislature, which sort of propelled them to increased fame. So in their speeches, letters, and pamphlets, the sisters present a carefully written, clear, consistent argument with examples predominantly from the Bible. They ground their argument in scripture and appeal to their contemporaries. Their goal is clear: immediate abolition and complete integration. Okay. Questions, concerns, observations?
I apologize if this seems long-winded. So in all senses of the word, Sarah and Angelina kind of they fit all together into the word pioneers for both women's suffrage, abolition, just from the stories you've told us already. And my question, though slightly long-winded, is why do you believe these stories have almost been lost to history? Because, I mean, you mentioned Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Stanton. Everybody's heard those names, but why specifically are these names and others being left out of history?
Yeah, Sarah and Angelina were invited to Seneca Falls and chose not to attend. They believed that the women's suffrage movement wasn't doing enough for abolition and really for like true. And so I don't know exactly why they are lost to time, but later in their lives, they really stepped back from public life. Like they stepped back from public life and they just wanted to, they felt like they had done enough work and they didn't have anything more necessarily to say. And so they stepped back. But I don't know exactly why they sort of fall out of our collective memories. But I think this is such an important question about the way we understand the past and how we understand ideas through time, right? Like we only know what we have and we don't know what we've lost, really. Like sometimes we have a record of a book or a document or something that's missing without the primary source, but we don't really know those things. So I don't have a good answer for that, but it is an excellent. The Bible and the Critique of the Clergy. Okay, Sarah and Angelina Grimké are unmistakably devout Christians. A book has recently come out criticizing them on their devoutness. The argument in the book basically is why? Why did they have to fall back to the Bible? And I think the answer to that is they truly believed. They truly believed in the scripture. And so they couldn't have not done it. It would have been disingenuous not to have done it. Their writings and letters display a sincere and deep belief in Jesus, Christianity, the Christian Bible. And like many of their contemporaries, they understood the scripture to be the true word of God and a true account of human history and the human experience. They were well versed in the Bible, as were their contemporaries. They are not Machiavellian in their use of the Bible, just to be clear. They really are they're trying to reclaim the scriptures from their contemporaries who they believe were misinterpreting the Bible in order to defend the institution of slavery. In the first letter of what will become an ongoing correspondence with Mary Parker, the president of the Boston Female Anti-Slavery Society, Sarah is clear that she believes that her work is benevolent and will benefit the world and the people who inhabit it. This particular letter, written in 1837, is a response to Parker's question, what is the province of women? The letter begins with a salutation. My dear friend, Sarah states that she is in search of truth and no obstacle should prevent her from prosecuting that search because she believes that the welfare of the world will be materially advanced by every new discovery made of the designs of Jehovah in the creation of women. Sarah sincerely believes that the way to materially advance the welfare of the world is to learn the designs or intentions in Jehovah's creation of women. That is, in order to answer the question, what is the province of women, one needs to be able to answer the question, what did God intend the duties of women to be? As Sarah puts it, it's impossible that we should fulfill our duties unless we comprehend them or live up to our privileges, unless we know what they are. So her argument is, if you don't know what God wanted you to be or designed you to be, how can you actually live a good life? And part of their argument here is that the clergy in the South are misinterpreting the Bible for their own designs. And I think, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, but I think in our own time we're more attuned to sort of the biblical justifications for slavery that were posited at this time. And Sarah and Angelina actually go after these biblical interpretations. So the epistle, which was burned on the pier, which is a critique of the clergy, which I have to tell you, if I was the clergy, I would get offended by this letter. It is an exacting critique of the ways in which the Southern clergy misuse the power that they have over the people in order to perpetuate the institution of slavery in the United States. So the epistle is published in 1836. It's just over 10,000 words and was part of this abolitionist mass mailing campaign. Mark Perry writes in Sarah Grimké and Angelina Grimké on slavery and abolitionism that the purpose of the epistle was to undermine and embarrass Southern ministers who used the Bible to defend the indefensible, and it embarrassed them. And it got Sarah and Angelina into trouble. In the epistle, Sarah presents herself as an equal to the clergy, equally able to read and interpret the scriptures. So in some ways, they're presenting an early version of a liberation theology, right? They're removing the hierarchy of scriptural interpretation, and they're setting themselves up as equals to the clergy who are using biblical justifications for slavery. And it's interesting because she refers to them as her fellows. She doesn't refer to herself as their fellows. So she begins from a position of equality, which would have been unheard of for a woman at this time. So in the epistle, she makes this argument where she compares the United States to a fallen Jerusalem, and she likens herself to a prophet. And so she really does set herself up as sort of having some kind of divine, having some type of divine compulsion or divine access to be able to interpret the Bible. She says that she feels a portion of that love glowing in her heart towards the Southern clergy, which is infused in every bosom by the cordial reception of the gospel of Jesus Christ. So she presents herself as loving the clergy. She says that her heart turns with feelings of intense solicitude, even though such feelings may bring her to gushing tears of compassion. She understands herself as motivated by a deep and abiding love for humanity. She cites numerous passages from the scripture which her contemporaries would have been familiar with. She cites Luke 19:45-48, where Jesus cast the merchants out of the temple. She cites Luke 13:34 and Matthew 23, which is regarded as the end of Jesus' public ministry. And she addresses the failures and inadequacies of the religious leadership of Israel. And as she addresses her fellow professors of this holy religion, she reminds them that in a meaningful way, they are no longer fulfilling their covenant with God because they are misrepresenting the Bible for their own particular political ends. And Sarah argues that not only have the clergy misunderstood the Bible's teaching, a mistake that perhaps could be forgiven and easily remedied if they accepted her interpretation, but they have been corrupted by the depraved politics of their southern states and misrepresented and corrupted God's design in pursuit of their own political power. They use their positions of religious authorities to commit and justify atrocious sins. Sarah reminds the clergymen of actions that they have condoned. There was the burning of the abolitionist pamphlets in Charleston. In Nashville, there was the whipping of abolitionist minister Dresser. And then there was the destruction of Mary's printing press in Cincinnati by an angry mob. And so there are these instances that the clergy condone in order to uphold the institution of slavery and maintain their own power. America, according to the Grimkes, is like a fallen Jerusalem, which kills its own abolitionist prophets and orchestrates its own demise by refusing to repent for the sin of slavery. Sarah echoes Moses in Deuteronomy and warns the ministers that abolition is not a vain thing for you because it is your life, because the longevity of the country depends on the choices that these ministers make now. Sarah says she is compelled to address these ministers as part of her solemn sense of duty, which she owes as a Southerner to every class of the community of which she was once a part. Sarah does not present herself as a Northerner who arrived to remonstrate to Southerners for their racism. Rather, she is a Southerner concerned for her community and for friends and family. Like those whose pamphlets have been burned in Charleston, or those who have been whipped in public for their abolitionism, as a proto-feminist woman and an abolitionist, there is no place for Sarah or her sister in the South. Sarah and Angelina both reevaluate the magnificent scene of creation, which they argue is misinterpreted by the clergy. They actually go into deep reading regarding translation. And we can talk about that after. But they say that the translation of the Bible that they have received misrepresents the idea of creation in God's image, and that it presents, and that the idea that it presents women as of lesser virtue than men is in fact a misreading. That we should read that part of creation as human beings being created equal in the image of God, and that they ought not be held as property. Enslavement, Sarah explained, has wrested the scepter of dominion from the enslaved man's hand. Slavery is seized with an iron grasp his godlike being and torn the crown from his head. So for Sarah and Angelina, suffrage and abolition go hand in hand. You cannot have one without the other. In the epistle and in later writings, Sarah and Angelina directly address the curse of Ham. For those of you who are not familiar, the curse of Ham is the biblical justification for race that became the biblical justification for race-based slavery in the United States. After the flood, Noah gets himself incredibly intoxicated. You may be familiar with the story. His son Ham goes and sees him in his drunken nakedness and goes and tells his brothers. Some people argue that there is some sexual impropriety there, and is punished. And the punishment is that Ham will be subservient to his brothers for this sin. And Sarah and Angelina, and this becomes like one of the primary justifications for race-based slavery in the United States, the curse of Ham. And Sarah and Angelina make this argument in multiple texts. They argue that just because the Bible includes this account doesn't mean that Noah behaved justly. doesn't mean that Noah's curse of his son is in fact a just curse. It doesn't say that. At no point does God say, and Noah was correct in the curse of his son. And if you read this passage in light of other passages in the Bible, it can't be a true, it can't be the true interpretation of God's will, because God would never justify any type of harm of anyone else. It's interesting because in many ways this is a very modern argument that Sarah and Angelina are making. So Sarah asks her readers to pause and examine this passage and to think about what it really means and whether or not truly in their hearts they believe that God would condone the buying and selling and harming of other human beings. If God has an injunction against the shedding of blood, why would God permit this other atrocity to occur? Supporters of slavery in the antebellum period frequently invoked this example from the Bible and the Curse of Ham. And Sarah and Angelina reevaluate. They cast themselves as equal interpreters of the Bible to the clergy, and they provide an alternative explanation of this particular passage. And if they're correct in this alternative interpretation of the passage, then the underlying justification of and grounds for slavery must also be incorrect. And they take this interpretation to the Southern women. So they write numerous letters to the women in the South. Why did they do this? They're the people that they know the best in the world, right? They're the women who are like them, right? They are writing to their cousins, their friends, their mothers. They're writing the letters to themselves in a meaningful kind of way. And the argument that they make in these letters is that Southern women often cast themselves as victims of the state. That is, Southern women often cast themselves as subject to the men in their society. They are vulnerable, and they are, right? They do not have the same power afforded to them as men at this time. However, Sarah and Angelina argue that Southern women actually have more power than they give themselves credit for having. They just have to be willing to give up the luxury that is afforded to them, which they recognize is not an easy thing to do. Sarah and Angelina are not. But they make an argument that Southern women owe it to their own children to take a stand against slavery, a stand in favor of abolition, even if it risks the comforts that they are given in their lives. Because as mothers, what they are basically, they're setting their children up to live in an unjust state. They're setting their children up to perpetuate violence, to learn hatred, and that they really need to be willing to give up their own luxuries, their own comforts, in order to effect political change. So Sarah and Angelina, they're very critical of Southern white women. They say that they will relate to the Southern white women unwelcome truths about their country, their men, and themselves. They say that while many white Southern women enjoy comfortable and affluent lives, it is imperative that white Southern women face the truth. The men they know, their fathers, husbands, and sons, are polluted by licentiousness and often are compelled to witness in their own domestic circles those disgusting and heart-sickening jealousies and strifes which disgrace and distract the family of Abraham. They argue that the ideals of America are compromised as a result. Sarah and Angelina argue that white Southern women are pampered in luxury and nursed in a school of tyranny. The comfort, luxury, and safety that they experience is predicated on injustice. White women, they argue, are as culpable as men in the atrocities permitted by Southern states and their inhabitants at this time. As a consequence, beneath the external appearance of genteel manner and aristocratic airs, Southern white women are corrupt, and a corrupt tree cannot bring forth good fruit. It is impossible, the Grimké sisters argue, for Southern women to deny the sins that facilitate their lifestyles. They argue that Southern women are educated to be subservient and educated to perpetuate tyranny. They remind Southern women of the abuses that they experienced at the hands of their own husbands and fathers. And they remind Southern white women of the abuses that their husbands, fathers, and sons perpetuate against enslaved Black women. They bring forth the example of the Book of Esther. They have all sorts of biblical examples of radical biblical ladies who fought power. And this letter begins with an epigraph from Esther, for those of you who are familiar. The Book of Esther explains the Feast of Purim. Esther was the wife of the Persian king Xerxes I. She was Jewish, and she was living in hiding and married to the king. And the king's minister, Haman, sort of has this plot to massacre the Jewish population in Susa, the capital of the Persian Empire. And Esther could have remained silent, enjoyed the privilege of being in the court, and the court of the king, not the legal court. But instead, she chooses to take a stand, and she risks her own comfort and well-being. And this is just one example of many biblical examples of women who risk their lives in order to facilitate a particular type of political change. So Sarah and Angelina basically give the Southern women 4 tasks. The first is to read their scripture, because if they read their scripture correctly, they will come to realize that the interpretations that they have been given are in fact incorrect. The second is to pray, because they are devout. The third is to speak on the subject. It's dangerous and illegal. And the fourth is to act. And for Sarah and Angelina, there is no other option. I return to this question I asked at the beginning. What does it mean to live in a world that you think is upside down, and how do you come to know? Sarah and Angelina understood that it is dangerous to challenge regnant power and regnant authority for themselves and for those to whom they appeal. But they also truly believe that their lives are at stake. They believe that the Bible is being misused by opportunistic clergy as a justification for slavery, violence, and harm. They believe that they have a duty to speak the truth and to turn the world upside down, or perhaps even right side up. Thank you so much. Questions, concerns? In class, I asked for rate points, sometimes I get that.
Hi, I'm Kimberly. I'm wondering if you know what the sisters maybe thought of John Brown. You had said that they believed they had a divine ability to be able to interpret the Bible. And I know that he himself was like a devout, like Puritan specifically, not Episcopalian, and really believed that he was God's martyr to end slavery. And he chose a much different route. So I was curious if there's any evidence that they had any opinions about him.
Thank you so much for this great talk. I agree that the Grimké sisters don't get talked about a lot. But there was like a couple years ago, I think like PBS put out a documentary on the abolitionists, and like one whole episode was on them. And I'm just curious what you think of the interpretation that I've sometimes seen about them, that, you know, they're not like some of the other abolitionists who are directly engaging with the state, but they're coming at this from like a very Christian point of view, and basically like focused almost on their own personal salvation and not really the abolition of slavery, right? Like, whereas like, you know, you have like Garrison, Douglas, Brown, et cetera, right, who are like directly engaging with like overthrowing slavery. Do you agree with that criticism, that they are more like focused on themselves and how they relate to it?
So I think that's a good question. So I've been asked this question before, and I think in many ways they're autodidacts, right? Like they lived at home, they snuck into their dad's library and they read books, and they decided the world was just not right. And they felt a divine compulsion. And they did believe that unless they spoke out against slavery, they would be eternally damned. And unless, you know, other people changed their views, they too would be eternally damned. They're hard pacifists. And they really like, so I didn't talk about this, but briefly I think I mentioned it, but they joined the Quakers. And they ultimately sort of left the Quakers after Angelina got married, but they 2 points. The first is, so because of that, they were passive and they were ready to die as martyrs for the cause. But they also, I think, in many ways, like part of their split with other abolitionists is they were integration, and they didn't want any segregation, and they refused to compromise those values in order to join other groups. Because as soon as you join any political movement, you agree to the terms of that political movement. And I think in many ways they just didn't agree with most of sort of the organized abolitionists.
Thank you again. I was wondering if you see the legacy of Sarah and Angelina within the women's activists today in any of the movements that might be coming about as of current.
Some examples of maybe where
you're good. I'm just trying to think about that. I don't know, maybe with the overturning of Roe v. Wade, do you see maybe actions that they might have taken in the past on something of that subject currently being executed upon, or do you think we have a more violent approach? Because as you said, they're pacifists. So do you think that would work nowadays, being more outspoken and just sending, letters of critique? Do you think that would be more of the approach that we should take nowadays, or do you think the kind of more aggressive approach would be a better way of changing our system currently?
And beyond the scope of this talk, this is beyond the scope of and there are people who study social movements who have a far more nuanced understanding. I think Sarah and Angelina believed that they had a moral responsibility to say the things that they thought were true, even if it compromised their comfort, well-being, and life. But I think they believe that there are lines you cannot cross in the pursuit of your ends, because in the end that corrupts you in a different kind of way. And so they had, and that's not to say there aren't times and places where when there are times and places where people come to believe that they've spoken enough and it's time for other forms of action, right? But they were upholding a set of religious and biblical principles that they truly believe in, and those included non-violence. And you do not cause harm regardless. And so I think that sort of, for them, that is such an essential facet of how they understood themselves and how they understood the moral code, the moral design, right? God's design of the world was to be nonviolent. And to add violence to the world in order to correct an injustice just adds more violence, I think, is their argument, even though they're suffering, right? And there are lots of good critiques of this argument, but I think that's how they understood themselves. Yeah.
All right. Really good talk, by the way. And since this is being recorded, I'd like to go on record. I am not advocating for slavery before I start talking and put my foot in my mouth. But you mentioned how a lot of their beliefs, if not all of them, were backed by biblical standards. That's the text they went to. That was the bedrock of a lot of their arguments. I was wondering how they could square something like the book of Philemon with that argument, because in the book, Paul sends Onesimus the slave back to his master, gives him 4 explicit commands. None of them is to free him as a slave. It's accept him as a brother, prepare lodging, a couple other things. So at least explicitly, he doesn't say, now that he's become a Christian, you are to free him. So how would they square that away?
Talk over. In their writings, they actually have like a very detailed critique of the differences between the biblical institution of slavery and chattel slavery in the United States. And so they really do parse that out. And I think, I'm trying to think of the exact number of reasons, and I can't remember it off the top of my head, but the argument goes something like this. Yeah, throughout the Bible, there are all sorts of justifications for slavery, right? Slavery is an institution in the Bible, but the biblical version of slavery is not the same as the slavery in the chattel slavery in the United States, where you're born into slavery, you inherit it from your parents, slaves are regarded as inhuman. And so I think that's part of the response. And they basically talk about the ways in which the examples in the Bible provide reprieve, right? They're not inherited. There are rules of conduct, etc. So I don't know if that answers your question. We can talk about it after, and I can actually send you, if you want, where they list it all out, but they have a very, very detailed critique in response to these kind of questions of how the biblical institution of slavery is not a so, yeah.
And thanks again for being here. You had mentioned they used the critique of the Southern clergy. How did that go for? I mean, was it just dismissive or dismissed? And we're going to keep doing what we're doing because the system works for us. Because I think Martin Luther King used the same reasoning in his letter from Birmingham jail to appeal to the Southern clergy, and it got nothing. So I guess did it work? It didn't work for. I mean, I think in history we can see appealing to the senses of clergy does not work.
Yeah, so I think they were absolutely. I think they were appealing. Right. So I think the appeal really, yes, it's an appeal to the Southern clergy, but it's really an appeal to people to reevaluate the ways in which they understand their spiritual leaders and where they are valued more importantly. I think that's an important concept, right? In many instances, the people, what would be the motivation of the Southern clergy to change their behavior? Because these two women are wrong. And I think part of their argument is what you're doing is actually wrong. Right? And you may not. So in the letter, you may not face punishment on earth, but you have to face your God, and your God is going to be very angry because you are misrepresenting your divine design, and you claim to be speaker for what God wants. And so I think that's the best response I have to that. But I can't think of an instance where clergy was like one of the Southern ministers was like, actually, I read your letter and I've changed my mind. I don't have a good example of that though. I wish I did, and maybe I should do more archives.
Erin, I know one of our students online asked if you describe more, what did it mean that America was a fallen Jerusalem, and how the Grimké sisters describe that situation of America?
Yeah, so that example basically talks about they present the United States or America as a fallen Jerusalem. And the sections in the Bible where they talk about this is sort of when the killing of Christ. Those are the sections, right? The city has turned against the word of God. It is ignoring the word of God. It is committing these heinous sins, and no amount of sort of argument or persuasion will turn them back upon the correct course. And for a Christian population, that is a very persuasive argument, right? Because what is the ultimate sin that you could possibly commit, right? And so I think that is how they compare the United States to a fallen Jerusalem. That they're not listening to their prophets, right? They're not listening to the people who are warning them that they are going down the wrong path, and the consequences could potentially be dire. their brother, the majority of their family were anti-abolitionists, and their entire economic order was built on slavery, right? So what was their incentive to join their wild sisters in undermining the comforts of their way of life? Right? They had no incentive. They did later connect with the mixed race children of their brothers. Their brothers were raping enslaved women quite frequently, and they ultimately found those nieces and nephews, and they helped them. So I don't know if that answers your question, but their immediate family was not, was very, they were shameful, right? These girls were very shameful. They were not nice Southern ladies who were maintaining order and like running the home. They were wild, ungodly females who were problematic, and that falls back on the family. Like, what did the family do wrong in order to create this two girl? They should have never let Sarah care for Angelina. So I don't know if that answers the question. Yeah, it's a good question. I find their family history really interesting. Like, it's complicated and interesting, and I think especially because, you know, we want to know how they came to these conclusions, and I think thinking through how they grew up. It's helpful for me at least.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. My name's Tim Barnett. I'm a professor here. And the title, A World Upside Down, kind of fascinates me. I see so much anger in these times from both sides, especially from activists on both sides. And I wonder if some of this anger reflects the fact that we have a very complex society where it's much easier to generalize about the world being disordered or these social injustices that exist. And it's much harder to, in a surgeon's fashion, actually drill down into the particular problems. So, for example, I think a sweeping criticism of democratic capitalism is misplaced, but I would like to see many elemental facets within capitalism corrected, where I think that there are, malfeasances that are very serious. And if we could rectify those, we would have a lot less excessive economic inequality. So my question is, what do you think of the view that I've just articulated, and do you think that that is realistic? Yes. Our times or their times? Thank you. Our times. I think our times have this complexity and the anger.
So we train ourselves in our times. Mr. Gross is repeating. We train ourselves in our times to see deficiency. And if you train yourself to see deficiency, there's a different number of deficiencies. And we're not always so great at being systems thinkers. I do think that Sarah and Angelina were pinpointing something very specific in the policies of their own time that could be rectified. So they don't have like a broad sweep of capitalism. They're looking at like two things, right? They're looking at policies that enforce slavery in the United States and policies that perpetuate the subjugation of women. So I think but they don't have a policy. They themselves don't put forth like a positive public policy. That's not quite their concern. I think in our own times, which is beyond the scope of my talk and my expertise here, as everybody else, just a person here trying to figure out how the world works. I think we live in a time where, as a result of mass communication, we have access to far more information than anybody has ever had ever. And Sarah and Angelina Grimké had far more limited information and access to far fewer opinions. And in our own time, we can put our thoughts in, if we have access to a phone, right? Internet our own our perspectives and desires into. And I think for Sarah, I don't know how they would view our own time. They'd probably be like amazed by, you know, cars and penicillin. But I think we do train ourselves to see deficiencies, and there's an infinite number of deficiencies. And Matt Grossman, actually, the political scientist Matt Grossman, I don't know, Matt Grossman, he wrote about this idea at some point, and I find it really helpful in framing contemporary discussions. If you're trying to create a policy, right? Every stakeholder is going to have a slight disagreement on how that policy should actually be enacted, right? So if you want to make a policy, people are just going to disagree on the particulars. But if you want to get rid of a policy, you don't have to fight about anything, just get rid of it, right? And so I think that's kind of connected to your observation. It's much easier to get rid of something, to declare it non-functional or not good, than to actually try and do the work of putting something in its place. Because as soon as you try and do the work of putting something in its place, each of us has an opinion, right? Like, let's say we're trying to get dinner together. We're going to have factions, we're going to have disagreements about what we want to eat. It's a mundane example. But if we're just like going home and eating dinner, we don't really have anything to argue about. So it's much easier just to remove things than to try and fix them or put them. I don't know if that actually answers the question.
Okay, it was a great lecture. I apologize on my deficiency of this time period of history. Sorry, hearing myself is awful. Was their family extreme in how they treated their slaves?
I don't know how to measure that.
Do you know what I mean? Like
were they particularly violent or terrible?
Compared to others?
I think they would argue no. I think they would probably say that the very institution in itself is terrible.
Well, obviously.
Like the degrees of terribleness are less important than the fact that it exists. I think that would be the argument that they would ultimately make. But I feel like there's more.
Like how extreme apparently that they were making children left and right, and obviously raping the hell out of, right. Sorry. Right. Well, I knew it was, at least my knowledge is that it was somewhat common, but I didn't realize how common it was. I just wonder if that is why the girls became such.
Yeah, I don't know. So the story that I about enslaved Henry to her read and then save her. They come back to that later as like how could this be possible? Elsewhere, she talks about how all of her earliest memories are being cared for by enslaved slaves. Right? Not enslaved women did most of her primary care as a child. And so she had relationships with these women, and she just couldn't believe that they were lesser than the other people in her life. Other people have argued that the story about Hetty comes later in her life. It wasn't as formative as she believes. I don't know. They don't present the events in their family as really influenced that what was accepted. I think part of the challenge is like we keep records. We keep records of what we want to keep records on, and we don't keep records on the things we don't keep records on. Right? So you don't have records because you don't want them. I mean, not us personally, but they don't have records because they didn't want them. And I think, like in public policy, we see that all the time. Like we measure certain things and not other things, and then those things become the important things. But we don't know what we're even missing because they didn't want to acknowledge this. But I think there's contemporary research coming out that says that it's far more prevalent than many. They never present the events in their many works or anywhere else. They always talk about it as pretty standard. I think it's such a good question.
Hey, how you doing? I'm doing fine. What other thinkers and works influenced them outside the Bible?
So they were very influenced, actually. So they read the Enlightenment theorists. They read Mary Wollstonecraft, which at the time was wild. We didn't talk about Mary Wollstonecraft at the time. And so I think those were sort of the thinkers that influenced them the most that they actually they have relationships with Lucretia Mott and other at this time they were really influenced by them. But most of their writing is based on
right there, the other behind you. Sorry, this should be my last question. I don't mean to hold on to the mic. So you mentioned earlier that they were removed from their church when they sent everything in, tried to convert the ideas of their family members. Did they go back to organized religion, or did they remove themselves from that kind of organization? Because I think that's something we're seeing a trend almost with Sarah and Angelina that they are very ahead of their time thinkers. And I think that's something we're seeing a shift of in our current days as of now. So I was just wondering if they were found a church that they ended up going back to, or they removed themselves from organized religion.
But they really did not do well with organized religion because they understood themselves as equally equipped to interpret the Bible as anyone is. And I think in many churches, they didn't like that. So I think they had a lot of trouble with organized religion. They actually had a lot of trouble with organized society. So they had trouble with social groups. They had trouble with social movements. Like they just weren't willing to compromise their I was going to tell a story, but I asked that earlier, and so I feel like it's time to I had no idea who they were. Certainly didn't learn about them when I went to high school in Canada or college in Canada. The University of Alberta, not the University of Alabama. So I'm a Canadian, and I didn't know who they were, and I never read them in grad school. And when I was teaching American political thought, there's a letter in the reader. And I was shocked by how my students responded to this letter. And my students were like, please, no, what's going on? And I was like, oh, interested. Why? And they were like, so modern. Like, despite the references to the Bible, their arguments are so incredibly contemporary. Strange way. And so there's something about Sarah and Angelina that really kind of speaks across time, or in my experience, speaks across time. And like all good projects, like many good projects, they start in the classroom and you start doing more research and you realize how much you don't know. And that's how this project came to be. And because I work in a liberal arts school, I read things all the time that I don't already know really well. And so when I first read the letter, I really liked it. You don't know quite how it's going to land. But it was such a good way to think about what we know, how we deal with conflict in our own social orders, what we do when we just everyone around us is doing things wrong, and how we move forward. That question about like violence, like when is it appropriate to be violent? Like what do you have to give up to be an activist? Like what does it actually mean to be an activist? And so that's how I came to pursue this project, is that I read it in class and I had an amazing discussion with my students. And in subsequent years, like the discussion remains really fantastic. And I wanted to know more about them. And I wanted to know more about their thought, and I wanted to know if they were consistent. So that's how I came to start studying them in the first.
I was just curious on their views towards the Civil War, because at first glance, obviously, a war not necessarily fought over slavery, but slavery being the ultimate issue seems like at least a net good. But given how radically anti-violence they were, a war, let alone a war of brother against brother with that level of death and destruction, probably not something they were on board with. So these two kind of ideas seem to be in conflict. So I was wondering if they ever published or made public those kind of views.
Thank you, by the way. There's this, at least modern movement, I don't know about historically, that their institutions are kind of tainted with this kind of structural oppression, especially of racial groups. I'm wondering if that's present in the Grimké sisters' writings, of whether or not they think that the structural oppression, whether or not it's inherent to institutions like the government or the church, would they call for reform or the dissolution of those institutions? And do they believe in the structural oppression, especially of racial groups and women, in institutions like the church and the government?
So I think they definitely, and they're not political in quite that way, right? Like they don't critique the government, right? They aren't interested exactly in how the institutions operate. They are more concerned with like the moral responsibility that people have to not commit. And so in that way, they're different than other abolitionist writers because they're motivated not by political reform. Like they don't really talk about the structure of government anywhere that I can. They're really concerned about what it means for individual citizens to live in a state that perpetuates slavery and injustice. That's sort of it. I don't know what they would feel like that. But that is their concern. They are motivated by a moral concern that is informed by their religious understanding of the world. And they do think it's broken, and they do think it's dangerous, but they do think that it's fixable if people stand up for what they ought to truly believe. But they don't talk about it on that level.
Thank you for your presentation. I have a question about how their approaches can have a lesson for today's issues. I think, especially in terms of interpreting the Bible, because some issues, for example, like abortion or LGBTQ rights, are still can be interpreted differently through the Bible. And what you mentioned is that those sisters actually have a passion about what they think that's about passion about what should be right according to Bible. And I think in many cases, in many different parts of political spectrum or ideological spectrum, they also, in some cases, believe their argument or their thoughts are right based on the Bible. So how do we make or can have a lesson from these sisters to have more constructive discussion?
It's a great question. And I think that is there one correct interpretation of the Bible question? And I think Sarah and Angelina believe that they had the one correct. I think they believe that they had a more correct interpretation of the Bible than the prominent religious figures at the time who were using the Bible to justify things that they thought were wrong. Now, I wonder about this question because I'm not sure contemporary sentiment would agree with their interpretation of the Bible on many contemporary. That sort of address the question.
Well, give a round of applause and please thank. I said it's been a pleasure to have you here, Erin. And I told her before. I said I'm going to screw something up in the introduction. I always do. So I apologize to Alberta, the entire state, the province. I know. Oh, don't please. God, that was easy. I know. Oh, but I appreciate everyone for coming. We do have a survey, of course, for online and in-house before you leave, if you're willing to fill it out to give us assessment, because this is the last one of the year. It's been a great run. We've had 6 lectures this year, 20 in the past 4 years. We really appreciate the support of everyone who's come and attended these. in-house or online. We appreciate the Jack Miller Center for sponsoring these and the Alabama Humanities Alliance for sponsoring these. It would not be possible without them. And we appreciate Erin again for coming today. Thank you so much. While it's the close of our series, I will mention it is the beginning of baseball. And so for all those who cheer for 162 games, good luck. We'll see you in the fall, hopefully. May your team still be in the race. If not, may you have traded your best players to the Cubs. And we look forward to seeing you again to the Tocqueville Lecture Series soon. Have a great night. Bye.